Hello everyone, so I'm Stefan, I'm from Automatisering, or we're now rebranding to Nordic AI to make it a little bit more internationally friendly. So what we're going to talk a bit about today is onboarding new commercial AI projects. So it's not so much about starting with a business idea, it's more that you have, when you have established a business more or less, you have some knowledge about how to set up new AI systems, technical solutions and so on. How do you go from actually talking with decision makers who are going to make a decision about whether to invest in you as a developer or you as a team to actually get started with making these projects and making these systems for them as customers. So in this presentation, I will use the term onboarding more in the sense of what happens from you start talking with an interested decision maker to the point where they actually sign the contract. So a little bit different than the kind of onboarding from that, from what happens after they sign the contract. In this case, it's what happens in between this, because now we're in the point in between the actual marketing and the point where we actually land the client. So a little bit of a black hole between marketing and sales, which you don't hear so much about. So yeah, I'm the founder and also the operating officer of this AI company. We got registered in September. I've operated as a founder in this type of tech projects for a little over a year. So I've started to get some experience with the onboarding of these type of projects. So some of the things I will go through in this presentation will be about how complex it can be to onboard some of these deals, especially as it starts to get bigger in scope. The 4 key challenges in this process, what some of the differences between the private, these types of projects for private companies compared to the public tender offers, as well as showing a real life case study that we've been through in our experience. So we'll end with some questions afterwards, but if you have any questions on the way, feel free to reach out about that. So what are some of the complexities that are involved in landing these kind of commercial AI projects? In many cases, there can be multiple stakeholders. In this case, it can mean that the more players you have involved in the discussions, the higher the chance there are for miscommunication, especially when it's not necessarily just
to double check, are you talking about multiple stakeholders in the company or the interested company?
I'm talking about multiple stakeholders in the different parts of the value chain. So it's not necessarily just that you as a company or you as a freelancer, in a sense, are talking with a customer and a customer company at hand, but you may have subcontractors. You may have another company who does part of the development or all of the development for you. So you have to coordinate first with the customer, and then you have to see, okay, is this something we do in-house or that you do yourself with the resources capacity that you have available? Because with smaller projects, you may be able to deliver it yourself. But if it's a bigger project, then you may not have all of the resources or capabilities to deliver this by yourself. Then you may need to talk or see if you're working in a bigger IT company, see, okay, what kind of resources do we have available for this? Or do we have subcontractors with the relevant competencies to actually deliver on this? So this is what I mean by multiple stakeholders, and I will later on with a real life case study, I will show a case where there was a customer, an intermediary, us as an AI automation company, as well as a subcontractor. So 4 parts in that value chain, which increases the complexity involved in landing such a project. And especially as there are these bigger projects, in some cases maybe with public tender offers as well, there may be 2 or 3 or 4 or maybe even 5, 6 companies involved in delivering on these bigger projects. And that's why it also is necessary with kind of diverse skills involved in this onboarding process. It's not just that you need to have the technical capabilities to deliver on the project, but you also need to have some sense of understanding their business needs, understanding why are they interested in this solution, what do they have to gain from this, and then translating that into technical details. Because often a big mistake that is often made in this case is that you make too big of assumptions based on what the customer says they want, but they are too unclear or they don't understand that in order to translate this to an actual technical system that they want in the application or in the system they want, there's a lot more technical details and complexity that is involved to actually deliver on this than what is expected. And it is in this transition or this process that it is important to actually understand and recognize that you don't pick up all the details just from the first discussion with the customer. You need to sit down and see and analyze and do some preparation and research work based on what the customer says they want. And then, or maybe even talk to the subcontractor about it if they are going to be involved to some degree, and look at this to make this translation process. But this is also what I will talk a little bit more about later on. Another thing is that there's also long sales cycles in many cases, especially if you're going into mid-size or bigger companies. You're often faced with bureaucracy, bottlenecks, and shifting priorities in a sense that makes it really important to follow up, really important to take active initiative to make sure that you actually land the contract. What I usually what I usually tell my team is that no matter how hot your lead is, you're never 100% guaranteed to land the client. That's why you need to put in the work and pay very careful attention to the process to increase the likelihood that you'll actually go from an interested lead to a paid and signed client. Because it's really easy when you're drawn into these processes to get too high on yourself and that you think that this is a guaranteed client, and then something happens, anything can happen, and then they go out the window or they are forgotten in a sense at the end of the day. So these are the 4 key challenges that we're looking at in onboarding. You have to have the business understanding. You need to understand your customers' needs and goals. Then you have to translate that into the technical details involved in actual delivery of the project. And then you need to coordinate your resources and capabilities to deliver on this type of system. The expectations at the timeline for the project, how many hours will be involved, will it take weeks, will it take months, will it take years, and then see based on that how many hours are involved in this and what may the hourly rates be for this or for these resources, so that you can actually build on that and set a price out to the customer that is reasonable compared to the actual work involved in setting up this system or project for the customer. Because the more thorough you are in this process, the more professional you also show yourself out to the customer. It's different from just going as a freelancer to a business and say, okay, I can do that, without actually showing anything. Okay, you may have a little bit of a portfolio, but if you can actually showcase that through paperwork, through technical details, that you know how to translate the business needs to actually document how the system will work more or less, and have a clear plan how this will, a reasonable, rational plan for how this will be delivered, they are much more likely to take you seriously in this process from there. And then also, of course, there is the legal and documentation work. Be very careful about the contracts that you go into as well, because, and this goes also hand in hand with the technical planning and the team coordination. Because, for instance, if you have subcontractors who do a lot of the development work for you, and you end up not having clear contracts in a sense that make sure that you end up with some profit, then eventually you end up with it being way more work than you initially expected, and you need to pay way more in cost to the developers than you expected, and you end up with nothing in profit, or maybe having to pay the developers out of your own pocket, which is the worst case scenario in a sense. But yeah, so it starts basically with this, right? The business understanding, have a clear communication with the customer, have the onboarding meeting, try to understand when they first come in, why are they interested, and analyze based on that, trying to see, okay, is based on what they're trying to say. Often there is a very degree of documentation that they have done from before. In some cases, they have done absolutely no documentation of their system, of their processes, and so on, what actually needs to be done. In other cases, they have done a little bit more of this. But in my experience, at least, there are many cases where they have not done so much of this documentation, and then you may need some, like 2 or 3 discussions to actually get clear on what type of processes or what type of needs to be fulfilled in this process. And this is the first step, and this is why it's also important to follow up to not lose them from the sales cycle as well. What I generally do and what I recommend in these cases is that if you're first gotten them into one meeting as an interested lead, make sure to like book a follow-up meeting within the same meeting. Otherwise, they may, like, you never know what can happen. Even if they say that they will get back to you on an email or anything, if you can book another meeting next week or so on to follow up, it's much easier to actually return to base there, because you never know what can happen. You have no guarantees that they will actually send the email that they said they will. But with the translation process from business needs to technical needs, what I generally use is some paperwork. These are called the tech spec and the SRS that I generally use. So a tech spec is generally a basic outline of the system architecture, technical requirements, generally a one-pager of how the system and tech stack of the system will be built up. And then the SRS may be a bit more comprehensive in a sense for how the system will function, performance criteria, constraints, and so on. And it may depend in many cases on how established you are as a business or a freelancer or an actual provider of these systems, how much of the research process you need to do before rather than after you've actually landed them as a paid client. Because if you're starting from the beginning, you haven't done many of these paid projects before, you may be just starting out as freelancer or just starting out as a new company, then you have more to prove in a sense. The newer you are, the less of these projects you've done before, the more you have to prove to them. And then in many cases you have to do more of this research before you actually land, get them as a signed client. You have to do more free work for them in a sense to show that you are able to deliver on this in a good way. But these are what we generally use in a sense. We go from the business understanding, we try to outline as well as we can. You can find templates of these online as well if you search them up, and it will help a lot with actually delineating to a much better extent how the system will look in practice.
I was wondering, how do you approach understanding the problem and like getting to know the customer? Like, what is your approach there?
Yes. So then generally we're trying to understand what's like is it a. In many cases there it depends on what the business issue is. In some cases it may be an issue of automation, right? That is a matter of a workflow that they're trying to automate. In that case, if they're focusing generally on the workflow part, then we need to understand how the workflow looks. Then we generally try, for instance, I had a talk with a lead today actually about this, where they said, okay, they have this number of workflows, they want to automate some of this. And my suggestion was that, okay, if you haven't documented all of this from before, then here's a link to a standard operating procedure, like in Norwegian prosedyrebeskrivelse, for how this is done basically from start to finish, in a sense, for the actual manual steps that you need to go through to actually deliver on this. So this actually is something I worked on a lot when I worked in Fjordkraft, the energy company here in Norway as well, when I was using Python to automate many of the controlling and reporting processes as well. I started with basically looking at, okay, what do I actually do manually here in this process? Okay, I take this Excel file out of this system, I take this Excel file out of this system, and then I look at this column, and then I look at this column, and then these have to be matched based on the trade and based on these different similarities and so on. And then I can just translate that logic, that manual logic, over to kind of computer logic in a sense through code, or possibly in some cases through other automation softwares like Make or similar. So it depends on what the problem is, but in the workflow case, it's about understanding how the process is done manually, and if it's something else like the actual system involved is to understand generally how it's generally still how things are managed otherwise. For instance, if they have the documents and files locally on their computers in Word files and Excel files and so on, and not in the cloud or some kind of centrally managed documentation management system, then we can just say that, okay, these have some disadvantages in terms of the management. This has some disadvantages in the sense that you can't really build data-driven processes based on that, compared to if you have them in SharePoint, for instance, where you can use them with Copilots or integrate them with Power BI dashboards and so on. But yeah, it generally starts with that. It starts with understanding what they have as a pain point in general, what their challenge is in general, and then seeing, yeah, based on what type of problem that is, do we solve that with an automation workflow, or do we solve that with an AI agent, or do we solve that with some custom code or some other type of technical system, and so on, depending on what the actual challenge is involved there. And then based on what we find from there, then we try to delineate a plan from that, using either a tech spec or and the next step in the next step, and SRS, to actually delineate why we have chosen that as our suggested system or suggested solution for their problem in this case, because then it helps define the scope, size, and cost involved with actually setting up this system for them in this case. And this also where the difference between public and private projects come into account. I've been through several of the onboarding processes with relevant private projects with private companies, and started to get some experience as well with the public tender offers here in Norway, and see that some of the difference here comes that it's generally in the public tender offers, it is more specified from the beginning that these are the requirements, these are the technical requirements. There you get a list of requirements, you get a detailed overview of what type of system, what type of project you're generally going into. But of course, these are generally bigger projects, much bigger scope, and you need a much bigger team of resources as well involved to actually complete the project. Not to mention that they're also usually very competitive, and takes a lot of work to showcase that you're able to deliver on the public projects, compared to the private projects, where you need more of the discussions and digging to define what the problem in the business actually is, understanding the scope, and it offers more flexibility in a sense, but yeah, extra effort to uncover the details, but it is more varied in the scope involved. It can be from probably in the smallest cases, like you can take down to like a few thousand kroner if you're working like 2-3 hours for a very basic solution. But generally it would vary between like a few tens of thousands of kroners up to like it can be up to millions there too, of course. But generally it's much more widespread in range, making it easier to get into there if you're just starting out than these public tender offers. But what is actually notable about the public tender offers, which many seems to not to understand, is that you don't need to be a massive company to be a part of the public tender offers. If you cooperate with other IT companies who are maybe a little bit more established than you, maybe some other mid-sized IT companies, and coordinate and organize with them and work well along with them, it's still possible to be a subcontractor to other IT companies in these processes as well, which is notable that like even if you're a startup company with 2-3 people, if you're just a little bit active with building connections and active with landing them, it's possible to be a part of these projects as well. And then the third part, there is the managing teams and timeline parts. Of course, when you have translated the business requirements over to the technical requirements, then you have some more basis to see that, okay, in order to deliver on this system, you need people to actually do the coding, to actually deliver on this project. And then you need to see, okay, what type of people do you have available who can actually do the physical work involved when developing this solution. You may have an internal team with very degrees of skills, strengths and weaknesses and so on, and based on that you may get some understanding, okay, this guy knows a little bit about this, not so much about this, but this guy is very good at this. Then you can divide resources and responsibilities based on that. And if you don't have all of those resources or all of those people or skills available in your own in-house team, then it's relevant to bring in subcontractors or other kind of partners for this as well, and see, okay, can they deliver this, do they have the relevant resources, and having that discussion with them in these cases as well. But this is also a case where it can be a little bit sensitive in terms of the translation process from the business requirements to the technical requirements as well, which I've seen from my own experience in a sense when I'm talking to our subcontractor in a sense for actually getting estimates of the timeline and so on. Because if we're using a subcontractor in that sense and they're using paid hours to set up these overviews of how and estimations for a project they are not even guaranteed to be a part of, then they're not so eager to do that in many cases, which is the risk in that sense, which makes in some cases you will have to do more of that technical translation on your own, and then bring that to the subcontractor and ask if that's something they can help out with. So yeah, but having clear processes, having clear systems and so on, using these tools like TechSpec SRS helps a lot in the process and makes it easier when you're talking with your team, when you're talking with possible subcontractors of what is actual work involved here, so that you will be able to divide resources and responsibilities from there. And then of course there's the legal and compliance essential. Be sure to have the proper contracts and so on in place. For instance, NDAs, it's good to have with your partners, with the customers. In some cases, the non-disclosure agreement, taushetsavtale in Norwegian, as well as the DPA, especially when you're setting up these technical systems or the AI systems where you are managing data. In some cases, maybe even personal data. There comes in a question of the GDPR issue, and then it's very good to have in place these data processing agreements as well as part of the actual customer contracts. Another part which is important as well, keeping written records of the actual communication you've had both with your customer and with subcontractor. Generally what we're doing is we have everything in SharePoint in a sense. When we're having Outlook and email communications, we save the documentation in SharePoint so that we can go back to that and verify if there arises any issues on the way, and we can go back to that and see, okay, what was actually said when and with whom in that case. But when you actually get to the point where the customer is satisfied, you've gone through all of that other processes, then you can use, in some cases, the SSAB is one example, is the kind of public tender offer kind of standard contract for those types of projects. It's relevant for the bigger projects, especially the public tenders and bigger, more enterprise projects in general. Maybe a little bit too intimidating for small private clients. It's a really big contract template that I used a really long time minimizing, even for a relatively big private client. But yeah, so if it's a smaller client with like if it's a few tens of thousands of kroners, it's not the contract part is not as essential, of course, as if it's 100,000 or a million kroner contract or whatever. But it's good to be aware of this, especially as you get bigger in the size of the scope of the project and more and larger money sums are involved. Then the legal part is even more essential. That you cover yourself in case anything unexpected may happen on the way, which may make one of the parties not able to pay or not able to deliver. Then it's good to have established processes within the contract of what you're actually going to do in those cases as well to minimize the risk in this sense. So yeah, for a case study of this, there was actually a project that we were in a sales cycle of that had a potential project value in initial phase of like 10 to 13,000 euros, around 100,000 to 150,000 kroner in the first phase, potentially up to over 300,000 Norwegian kroner. But we failed to get this, and it was part of the reason was it got a little bit too complex. In a sense, we had 4 different players involved in the value chain here. We had the customer, and then we had an intermediary who brought this customer to my attention in a sense, as in a sense like recruiting company or lead gen company in a sense. And then we were kind of the company who was going to deliver on this, but then we also had the subcontractor involved in this. And we had discussions with intermediary, we had discussions with the customer, had discussions with the subcontractor, thought that everything seems good. There were just some minor things to clear up before we actually sit down with the customer and present a proper offer to the customer. But what happened? There was a preparatory meeting actually the day before we were going to present to the customer here, which led to a conflict in a sense between the intermediary and subcontractor. And there were misaligned technical expectations and communication issues where there seemed to be the case that some of the technical or some of the business requirements hadn't been adequately translated to the technical parts, and maybe also some of the organizational stuff hadn't been really clarified to a proper extent. So that was lost to another company working with this intermediary in a sense. So what went wrong in this case? So to me there was two cases or 2 factors that could have been done better, or which may contributed to this issue. That there was that the business requirements hadn't been adequately translated to the technical requirements. Possibly I could have taken a more active role involved in actually doing delineating the tech spec and SRS, because it seemed that when we had taken what the documentation from the customer over to the subcontractor, that wasn't done to a sufficient extent in a sense, and it seemed that the intermediary also misunderstood how thorough we needed that technical documentation for it to be clear to the subcontractor in a sense. So that because of this, it was unclear if it could be delivered on the original budget in this sense. It was also the case that the subcontractor, who is a relatively established outsourcing company with a quality process on the kind of developers and the development work that was involved, when the intermediary tried to kind of do tricks with this kind of with a technical delivery in a sense by using, or okay, what about we use Lovable in a sense for doing part of the work here, but of course then the subcontractor felt disrespected in a sense for this, because they were trying to mix a more amateur-based approach with an established development approach based on their experience in a sense, and that kind of miscommunication also increased the conflict here, which ended with them not wanting to do business with each other, even though it seemed we tried to clarify the situation in that case. Yes.
What does SRS mean again?
System requirement specification. Okay. So this is the more thorough kind of technical specification of how the system is supposed to look. So when you translate the business, like what the customer actually is looking for, over to how the technical system will look in practice from the back end or with the actual system, then the technical specification may be a 1-pager, but the SRS may be a more comprehensive document, like 3+ pages or so on, with more thorough information of how it's supposed to look in this case. So yes, so thus the lessons involved in this case, I would say, is that using a tech spec or SRS, having clear processes and guidelines for using this documentation, these templates in a sense, or these processes, help a lot with actually getting a better understanding of how much work, how difficult will it actually be to deliver on this project, and what resources do we need to deliver on this, to make sure you avoid any misunderstanding or any complications on the way. Because what is clear in many of these tech projects and AI projects is that there is this tendency of the scope creep, right? If you haven't defined clearly in the contract that only this is within the contract, this is what you're paying for, then the customer can say, oh, we want this for this feature, or we want this feature, and we want 5 features or 10 features more. And if you are not clear in the contract about this, then you may end up paying a lot more for delivery than what you expected originally. So that's part of what is important with a clear documentation, both in the first in the technical requirements, but also established in the contract that you sign with the customer. And then, of course, regular communication, being clear as you find out more in this research process, have that open dialogue with the customer, with the subcontractor on what you're figuring out on the way. And also, of course, to make sure that they stay in the pipeline, stay as a lead, and you actually get to continue the dialogue towards a potential sale, towards landing and signing the client. Keep the process moving, schedule follow-up meetings. You need to be really proactive in many of these cases, because you never know if you lose contact. Never expect them to reach back out to you. You usually have to do the follow-up and follow-up and follow-up either in email or within the meeting, as is preferred, in the sense that you always have a date to go back to if there are any bottlenecks and so on the way. And also, as mentioned, have clear contracts, build on standard templates and so on, and make sure that you minimize the risks involved in these projects. Because if you don't, it may end up taking a lot longer to deliver, with all the profit being gone, and possibly in the worst case scenario, losing money ultimately, or being liable for stuff you said you would deliver but couldn't in the end because you weren't clear about that in the contract. So yes, that's me. And then here's my LinkedIn, and then you can connect with me here with a QR code if you want as well. Any further questions?
First round of applause.